Did Jesus of Nazareth really exist? Jesus is one of the most influential figures in history. Today, there are billions of people who identify as Christians, and even the calendar that we use is based on the time we associate with his life. That said, there are some people who claim that Jesus never existed, that he's just a mythic, legendary figure who early Christians invented. So in this video, we're going to look at how historians evaluate people from the ancient world, and we will apply those methods to Jesus to see whether or not we have good reason to believe that he was a real person or just a legend. So unlike today, people who lived 2,000 years ago rarely had physical objects that historians can directly link them to. There are rarely statues or inscriptions or official records from a person's lifetime. And of course, there were also no photographs or videos or social media accounts. So historians tend to ask, when they're asking whether or not a person existed, they're looking usually for written accounts that mention that person, things like letters or biographies or histories written by later authors. And they're asking questions like, are there multiple sources that mention the person? How close in time are those sources to the events that they describe? And then do the accounts fit with what we know about the historical setting? When several early sources mention the same individual and those accounts align with the historical context of the time, historians generally consider that to be strong evidence that the person did exist. One example is that most of what we know about the philosopher Socrates, it doesn't come from Socrates himself. It comes from other writers. Socrates didn't write anything, but historians still widely accept that he was a real person because there are multiple early sources that mention him. Those sources were written in or very close to his lifetime, and then the descriptions fit with what we know about life in ancient Athens where Socrates' life took place. And so with this framework in mind, let's now look at the sources that mention Jesus. The earliest sources that mention Jesus appear in the New Testament, especially Paul's letters and the four Gospels. So these authors wrote in the first century within just a few decades of Jesus' life. There are many scholars who date Paul's letters to about the 50s, which is 20-ish years after Jesus' death. And you might be thinking that's a long time, but by ancient standards, that's actually pretty early. For comparison, many of the surviving biographies that we have of Alexander the Great, they were written more than 400 years after he lived, but historians still consider him a well-established historical figure. Okay, so Paul's letters refer to Jesus as a real person who lived in recent history, who was crucified, and whose followers believed that he rose from the dead. And then the gospel authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they wrote their accounts later in the first century. And their ancient biographies describe Jesus' life and his teachings and his execution. And I personally appreciate that the author Luke explains at the beginning of his gospel that he carefully investigated the events of Jesus' life and ministry and tried to write an orderly account so that the person he's writing to, Theophilus, could be confident about what he had been taught about Jesus. So Luke said, "Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught." Because these New Testament texts were written by people who believed that Jesus was God, we might wonder whether or not historians should actually use them and treat them as historical evidence. And I think it's fair to wonder that, but good to remember that historians do study texts by authors who have their own beliefs and viewpoints. In fact, every single historical source, whether it's ancient or modern, it does reflect the perspective of its author. So we'd have to get rid of everything if we weren't able to do that, right? Many of the works of Alexander the Great, for example, were written by people who revered him, but scholars don't exclude those texts to determine whether or not he existed. And in the same way, they don't exclude the New Testament authors to determine whether or not Jesus existed. Instead, they analyze the texts themselves. They are trying to figure out who wrote them, when they were written, what sources the authors used, and then how the accounts compare with what historians know about the historical context. So when historians analyze Paul's letters and the Gospels, what they find is several early sources that refer to Jesus as a real person who lived in the first century. But that's not all. There are also several non-Christian sources from the ancient world that mention Jesus. One of the most well-known examples comes from the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote in the early 2nd century, around the year 116 AD. And in his History of the Roman Empire called Annals, Tacitus describes the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Nero, and he explains where the movement came from. He wrote, Christus, from whom the name Christians had its origin, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus. And this reference is significant because Tacitus was not a Christian, and not only that, he was suspicious of and hostile towards Christians. So even as a critic, he's confirming that Jesus was a real person who was executed under Roman authority in the 1st century. There's also the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote near the end of the 1st century, and in his History of the Jewish People called Antiquities or Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus mentions the execution of James, identifying James as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. And this brief reference shows indirectly that Jesus was known as a real person in the 1st century. There are also other ancient references to Christians and their beliefs from Roman writers like Pliny the Younger and Suetonius. And while these sources focus more on the early Christian movement than on Jesus himself, they do, again, indirectly show that people across the Roman world referred to Jesus as a real person who had lived, and that many of his followers believed that he was divine. But that last part is a topic for another video. So if you remember those 3 criteria, those 3 questions we talked about at the beginning of the video, are there multiple sources that mention the person? How close in time are those sources to the events that they describe? And then do the accounts fit with what we know about the historical setting? The sources that we just talked about give historians multiple early and independent sources that mention Jesus. This includes writings from both followers of Jesus and critics of Jesus. They also appear within a relatively short period of time after the events that they describe, especially when you compare them to, many other figures from ancient history. As well, these sources fit with what we know about the historical context of the time, like the Roman rule in Judea, or Jewish religious movements, or the practice of crucifixion as a punishment for perceived political threats. When historians consider all of these factors together, the consensus is strong that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person. As the non-Christian New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman said in an interview, I don't think there's any serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus. There are a lot of people who want to write sensational books and make a lot of money who say Jesus didn't exist, but I don't know any serious scholar who doubts the existence of Jesus. Of course, historians still disagree about many aspects of Jesus' life and identity and whether or not he was God, but the question of whether or not he existed at all generally is not considered controversial among historians. Jesus was a real person, not a legend later invented by Christian writers. So now that we know Jesus existed, the next question is, who was he? So in the next video, we are exploring who Jesus actually claimed to be. And if you like, you can watch it by clicking the video on the screen just now. Otherwise, in the comments, I'm curious, before watching this video, had you heard the claim that Jesus might not have existed? And what surprises you most about how historians study the ancient world? If you have other questions about Christianity that you'd like to cover in future videos, feel free to leave those in the comments as well. And if you'd like to see more content like this, then you can click the subscribe button just below the video, and I'll see you next week.